Hello, everyone, and welcome to the SANS Threat Analysis Rundown webcast. This is our second in this webcast series. My name is Katie Nichols. I'm a SANS instructor for the SANS Cyber Threat Intelligence class. Going to be running actually in a week and a half if you have some free time on your hands. Not everyone does. I also work at Red Canary as an intelligence analyst, and I'm really excited to be joined in just a couple minutes by Brittany Barbehen and Robert Falcone from Unit 42, who are going to be talking about a campaign that they've found. So let's dive right in. I know it's been a crazy couple of weeks. We last saw you just over a month ago, and wow, how our lives have changed since then, huh? But as has become kind of my personal motto, the threats aren't stopping, so neither should we. Threat intel analysts, cybersecurity professionals, we're as important as ever. And so we wanted to proceed with this webcast, so we're happy you were all able to join us today. So let's dive right in. What's the purpose of STAR? Bring you the inside scoop from different voices about what's happening with threats around this community. And our whole goal is for you to learn about new cyber threats so you can take some action and drive improvements in your organization. So that's why we're here. Our agenda for today, first off, I'm going to give you a quick rundown of a couple of things that have been going on over the past month or so since we saw you last. Then I'll turn it over to Robert and Brittany for a deep dive into the xHunt campaign. And then we'll have a couple closing thoughts and wrap up with some action items for you, what you should do next. Today, March 25th, the rundown of kind of what's happening now. First bullet, no surprise, COVID-19. Coronavirus has changed all of our lives, all of our daily lives in the kinetic world, but we're seeing implications for the cyber world as well. Threats are changing up. Shared DeGrippo from Proofpoint, they see a ton of email traffic and notice there's so many coronavirus themed emails right now, whether it's web exploits, a lot of different adversaries using the coronavirus theme. And we hope actually to bring you more on that in our next STAR webcast in early April. So keep an eye out for that. But it's been kind of awesome to see folks around the community just sharing. Risk IQ has, sharing indicators. Domain Tools, I just saw this morning, is sharing indicators. These different groups popping up to help out as people are facing these threats. So I would just say to you all, keep that sharing up. It's been awesome to see. And remember that what you do is super important right now. And I know this is a really distracting time for all of us, but as much as we can focus on our jobs and tracking down these threats because they're still coming at us. So in the non-coronavirus news, it is annual report season. So it seems like, every day, every week, there's a new report coming out from different companies. Of course, FireEye's M-Trends, CrowdStrike had one. My own team at Red Canary did our threat detection report that came out last week, IC3. So a bunch of different annual reports. This is a great time for you to kind of take a look at what different organizations have seen based on different perspectives. So we have those linked at references at the end of the slides. And this webinar is being recorded, so you can check it out later as well as the slides. And if at any time throughout the webinar you have any questions, there's a Q&A panel in GoToWebinar. So open that up, ask any questions, and I'll try to pepper Brittany and Robert with questions throughout. Last thing I wanted to mention, this was sort of late February that this came out, but just kind of shows how long it's been. It's been a long month so far, but there was attribution that came out for the group known as Sandworm, roughly. It was attributed to GRU, Russian intelligence, and attribution based on the October 2019 cyber attacks in Georgia. So really interesting documents that came out both from the British government and the US government. Those are, again, a reference at the end of the slides. These are really interesting reading for kind of any intel analyst about how we establish confidence and make assessments. So I would really encourage you to check those out, even though they're a couple of weeks old, some good reading for you as we kind of give you a summary of key things I've found around the community over the past month or so. So with that, let's head into our deep dive portion of our webcast. I'm going to turn it over to two awesome intelligence analysts from Unit 42, Brittany Barbehen and Robert Falcone. Brittany, Robert, go ahead.
Thanks a lot, Katie, and thanks everyone for joining us remotely. My name is Robert Falcone. I'm a threat researcher focused mostly on malware research and tracking adversaries as they carry out their campaigns.
And I'm Brittany Barbehen, a threat intelligence analyst with Unit 42, digging in a little bit deeper than where just the tools go. All right, so anime doesn't typically come up quite often in cybersecurity research. So at least for me, and I think for Rob too, everything that we now know about anime, we learned because of this campaign research, which probably made it a little bit more fun for us since we got to research the characters and learn their stories. You know, it made it a lot more fun as we went along. Early on, still getting used to this slide transition, but early on we started seeing references to the anime, specifically Hunter x Hunter and Samurai X, which is how we came up with the name xHunt. More specifically, we found these references made within the suites of tools that the operators were using, the tools that they had developed and were using for 2 different campaigns. The overall analysis of the activity, one in 2018 and one in 2019, for us and our visibility both showed a very strong focus on Kuwait. Our visibility showed primarily Kuwaiti government organizations in 2018, and then a shift to the Kuwaiti shipping and transportation industry in 2019. Now, as a part of cyber threat intelligence, it's important for us to have some kind of an idea of the motivations of these adversaries. Sure, there can be some just because type of cyber activity, but more often than not, there is a specific thing. There's something that is driving the operator's intentions. And in this case, at least for the 2019 targeting of the shipping and transportation industry, we knew at that time that there were ongoing tensions surrounding the Persian Gulf, specifically within the Strait of Hormuz. And the headlines that you're looking at now on this screen are just a quick dollop of examples around the time frame of that activity. And these types of maritime tensions, they're not a new thing. And although we can't confirm a direct tie to the activity that we were looking at, we did suspect that there's likely some relation there. These types of regional tensions often drive cyber operations, not just for these types of threat operators, but in other areas of responsibility as well. Now, as a part of cyber threat intelligence, it's important for us to have an idea of the motivations of the adversaries. It's important for us to understand a little bit more than just why they're conducting these operations. We still need to figure out the who, the what, the how, and so forth. We need to figure out those things of standard research collection. So for us, in this case, it was actually working backwards from a timeline standpoint. And that's actually part of the story that we're going to tell you today in this webcast. Our shipping organizations were targeted beginning around May and June 2019. So this is on the back end or front end, however you're looking at it, of this timeline. We began around May and June 2019, and while reviewing and breaking apart their tool set then at that point, while digging into that is when we were able to trace the activities back to research that we had actually done in 2018 regarding attacks on those Kuwaiti government organizations.
Yeah, so now that Brittany's giving you a little bit of an introduction on what we're going to be talking about today, let's just kind of jump right into the campaigns that we saw and talk about some of the the activities that we saw, the techniques that they used, and some of the tooling that they used as well. And we'll make an effort to piece all these together to focus on the connections that we made and how we made the connections. So let's start with 2018, the Kuwaiti government organizations that were attacked. And the interesting part about these attacks was it was a little bit different for us when it came to our visibility. We came across these attacks not because our customer base was attacked, but one of our customers asked us about this specific tweet right here and asked us for a little bit more insight into it and who was associated with it, what threat group was involved, and so on and so forth. But this tweet was back in July of 2018, and it's an individual that said, Kuwaiti government organizations receive spear phishing emails. The emails had a link within it that link pointed to a Word document, and the Word document installed a PowerShell script. And the reply to the tweet at the bottom, you can see that the individual said the PowerShell script reached out to this domain, firewallsupports.com. So that's the first exposure we had to xHunt. The attacks in 2018 was from this tweet. So it didn't target our customer base. However, we were able to actually get the delivery documents that were associated with that attack. And sure enough, they were macro latent delivery documents. And once you clicked enable content, it would run a macro, install a PowerShell-based tool. And that PowerShell-based tool used DNS tunneling to communicate with its C2 server, which was firewallsupports.com. So at this time, we didn't have a name for this tool. We hadn't seen this tool before. So we didn't really have much to go on. So we just kept monitoring it for the next several months until we saw a Technic Post. And this is about the time where I named it Kahlua 200. And I apologize to the community for that name because it's really kind of silly and I'm just not good at naming things. However, Kahlua 200 is, like I said, a PowerShell-based tool that uses DNS tunneling to communicate with its C2 server. So one of the domains that we had associated with the use of Kahlua 200 was windows64x.com. And Brittany's actually going to talk about the infrastructure overlaps later on in this presentation, but this Technic Post is how, or that domain is how we found this Technic Post, which was in May of 2019. And so this Technic Post, the individual said, I'm seeing some of my domain controllers and some production servers pinging this domain. Why is this happening? And like I said, Windows64x.com is associated with Kahlua 200, and this tool we had done analysis on. This was generated. These pings were generated by that PowerShell tool. And because we had already done the analysis on Kahlua 200, particularly the DNS tunneling protocol, we knew the structure of that subdomain, and that subdomain actually had a unique host name built into it. So the C2 would know who they're talking to. And that host name wasn't just a computer name or username or something like that. It was actually hard-coded into the PowerShell script by the malware author. And when we looked at this, we were able to decode that, and it turned out it was the name of the organization that was involved or compromised here, and that was a government organization in Kuwait. So we were able to kind of tie back to that tweet, and this kind of confirmed that, yes, the government organization in Kuwait was indeed targeted by this. So interesting stuff. So I want to talk about Kahlua 200 a little bit. We're not going to have a lot of time to talk about all of these tools that xHunt was using in full detail. So throughout this talk, we're going to talk about the tools, but we're going to pick out one or two things that were the most interesting part about them. And in this case, Kahlua 200 has an interesting facet of its DNS tunneling protocol that allows us to connect to other things. So we're going to focus on that. So this is what Kahlua 200's DNS tunneling protocol looks like. This is it talking to a C2 server and receiving a command, who am I? So let's just take a look at that real quick. I'm not going to dive into every part of the structure of this DNS tunneling protocol, but what I do want to point out here is that this is the beacon that Kahlua 200 will send out over its DNS tunnel. And as you can see here on the right side, the DNS server responded with an IP address that had 92 as its first octet. And that actually tells Kahlua 200 that the C2 server wishes to send a command to the payload to run. Now I want you to keep that number 92 in mind going forward, because that 92 shows up in several different places that at first we didn't even notice, but as we started doing this research more and more, was an interesting overlap. So after receiving that number 92 as the first octet, the Kahlua 200 tool will send two queries out to receive the command from its command control server, via the IPv4 addresses here. All of these digits in the IPv4 address are ASCII characters, and that's how you piece together who am I just from the IPv4. So that's how Cache 200 was working. I mean, Cache 200.
I'm going to jump in with, so in terms of finding DNS tunneling, so like if you knew the windows64x.com domain, you could find this pretty easily. I'm curious if you had any suggestions for like detecting DNS tunneling if you don't know what domain they're using.
Yes, so as you may have noticed a few slides back, there were, set like a lot of different DNS requests that go outbound to just receive 6 bytes of who am I data for a command. DNS tunneling protocols generate a lot of DNS traffic. They're very they don't allow a lot of bytes per request to be sent back and forth. So if you have any way to keep track of the volumes of DNS traffic that's going outbound from your network, that's a pretty good indicator that something strange is happening, and a good way of identifying DNS tunneling.
Awesome, thank you.
I hope that answers the person's question.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so continuing on, so that was Cache 200. And Cache 200 itself wasn't really that interesting because, well, it is interesting, but it doesn't have a lot of functionality. But Cache 200 actually led us to another tool used by the xHunt, the group behind xHunt. And that tool is called Sakamoto. But we actually think they meant to call it Sakamoto because Sakamoto is the sword or blade that you're seeing here in this animation. And that is the sword that the character in the Samurai X anime uses. And this is actually the first instance in which we see the anime theme kind of coming into the malware authors tool set. And I'll explain why we think that this is related to this anime in a second. And I'll explain how we got from Cache 200 to Sakamoto as well. But let's just talk about Sakamoto itself, the tool. It has a command line interface and a graphical user interface. And the interesting part about the command line interface is the threat actors would use the command line to do an initial reconnaissance and uploading files. But the real purpose of the command line interface is to create a SSH tunnel that they're going to use to use an RDP session, a remote desktop session, over that SSH tunnel. And I'll explain in a few slides why we know that. But the whole purpose is to be able to use the Sakamoto graphical user interface, which looks like this. So when you first open Sakamoto, the graphical user interface looks like this. It's password protected. And you can see here the background of this screen is the X. It's like an X image. And that's the same image as the Samurai X's character's scar on his face. So again, this theme of anime is present all over these tools. You can see here that the window name is snapping tool, not snipping tool, which is a legitimate Windows tool. And you're going to see that pop up again in this presentation, in this tool set. But the password here is one of the most interesting parts. The password here is 2 characters. In fact, it's 2 digits, and then the password is 92, which is the same number as that first octet in the IP address of the command sent from Cache 200. Now that's a really weak connection, and we'll show why it gets a little bit stronger between Sakamoto and Cache 200. But it was something that was interesting when we discovered it. Okay, so once you enter the password, this is the tool itself. I'm not going to dig into every feature here because it's pretty feature rich. But I do want to point at this resources tab because if you click this agent button right here, it actually drops a Cache 200 payload to the system. And the specific Cache 200 payload that it drops is actually configured to use firewallsupports.com for its command and control server, which if you recall from that tweet, it's the same. So that was the real linkage that we used to connect these two. That this installed the same payload used in the July 2018 attacks. The other button here is a shell. If you click that, it drops a web shell to the system, which tells us that this group will deploy web shells to servers that have web services on them instead of carrying out or copying over their binaries and running them on the server. I do like the web shell itself isn't really that interesting. I just kind of want to show you what it looks like and then sort of make fun of it because it's broken right out of the box. It allows the ability to execute commands and upload files, which is pretty common in web shells. But this requires authentication, and that authentication mechanism is broken. You would never be able to use this without modifying the code, because it checks the parameter in the URL. It checks the MD5 hash of that parameter to a hard-coded MD5 hash that has 35 characters, which will never be successful. So therefore, this web shell will never work. Which kind of gives us an insight into maybe the developer of this web shell isn't as sophisticated as we thought. Okay, another part of this Sakamoto tool, which is very interesting, is this button Knowldege, which we think is just a misspelling for knowledge. And you'll see a theme. There's a lot of misspellings throughout this presentation. That's one of the things that we noticed with the actors involved with xHunt. They make a lot of misspellings. But this is something in all of my years of doing malware analysis I've never seen before. If you click this Knowldege button, it shows green text next to it, which is actually a cheat sheet for the operator using the Sakamoto tool. And we're not talking about how to use the Sakamoto tool. It actually gives it's a cheat sheet for how the actor should use Sakamoto to carry out things on the system, on the network, how to move laterally, all of these things, which gave us really good insight into how the actor would operate once they gain access to the system and network. So we extracted this cheat sheet, and it had multiple sections here, all sorts of things about like the tools that they use, the techniques that they use to move laterally, and credentials that they use to log into some of their services, that kind of thing. But at a high level, what we really found interesting about this, we're just going to highlight. They love Mimikatz, like other threat groups. They'll also use prop dump to dump memory to extract credentials. We know that they use this CMD5 tool to try to brute force those credentials, or to crack those credentials. But this is where we found out they use the Sakamoto command line to create an SSH tunnel with PuTTY-link, and they'll use plink to create that tunnel and then run remote desktop over that tunnel. So that's how we gained access to that kind of insight into their operations. But the other thing that was kind of cool from a tooling perspective is we found the threat group will use Bloodhound, which is a red teaming tool, and we believe they use it just like a red teamer would, to kind of map their attack patterns to get to their objectives. So rather interesting stuff. So in addition to some of the tools that they use, the cheat sheet actually included some other sections that were also interesting, like the box on the left for pan test, which we don't know what that means, whether it's pen test or whatnot. But you can see here that there's some Google Kung Fu here with .sa, .ph, and .ir as parts of their Googling, but we didn't see this group target those countries. This may suggest that their targeting is a little bit more broad than we had visibility to. So it just kind of gives us a little bit more insight into their operations. In the database section off to the right here, we see a select query for an Oracel database, which I'm guessing is another misspelling. But this tells us a little bit more about their motivations and possibly about their a broader targeting than just the government organizations and shipping and transportation, because this this select statement is for a call detail records organization software, which is sold to telecoms and mobile providers as it organizes call detail records. So that suggests that they may be targeting telecoms, but also it tells us that they're interested in some of the details that a call detail record would have within them. So it gives us a little bit more motivation, understanding of their motivations, which could include tracking people and communications like that.
Right, and all of these little details are great from an analytical perspective. They sometimes provide us with or leave us with a lot more questions than what we like, but often these little snippets, even the tiny little mistakes, they can often lead to a gold mine for us analysts. Now both tools and infrastructure can be make it or break it things for us. And so one of the things that we do is we take a look at the bigger picture from an infrastructure standpoint, and we do use things like passive DNS analysis. And sometimes it leads to a lot of goodies, and at other times you're left kind of, some people say going to the end of a rabbit trail and leading to some dark hole, and then you have to turn around and go back. But I think it leaves you standing more in cases like this, at the edge of this super cool summit, but there's nowhere else to go, so you just have to turn around and find another trail and move on. And this was us in 2018. We had this set of activity that was super interesting to us, but when we actually built it out as far as we could, we really didn't have as much of a story as we would have liked. And that's one of the reasons why we had never reported on it in 2018, and we sat on it and we waited and we watched and we tried to find more as things went along, and eventually it led to that Technic Post. And so we were able to really start building things out again at that standpoint. So to briefly talk you through our early on infrastructure analysis, as Rob mentioned previously, we began with the domain firewallsupports.com. This is the first command and control domain that we looked at overall in the 2018 analysis. And we began with a file that ultimately led us to Rob's silly name, Kashi200. And this domain also led us to identify about 10 different Microsoft Word lores and a few more Kashi200 samples. But this time, those new Kashi200 samples use the domain windows-updates.com. So now we have firewallsupports.com and windows-updates.com. And we started looking into it a bit more. We learned that the domain windows-updates.com, windows-updates.com has been used before by other operators. So in this case, it was extremely important here to take note of the registration details and the timings to ensure that we didn't trace this infrastructure into an entirely different swim lane. It's super easy. It's really easy to go too broad, too fast if you don't take the time as analysts to pay attention to those finer details. So we were able to pivot a few more times utilizing passive DNS, and we identified several other domains, which you can see on the slide here. And to point out a few on here more, the Windows 64X domain, again, that's the domain that Rob referenced earlier in the DNS tunneling activity and the TechNet forum post. And then another domain, pasta58.com, that is a domain that we saw used exclusively with the Sakamoto tool as well. And we continued pivots and doing our analysis and identified many other domains, ones that led us to additional lores with similarities to what we saw with firewall supports, but also indicative of potential targeting outside of Kuwait, in addition to that cheat sheet. The domain that you see in the upper right-hand corner of the screen, alpharetsystem.com, that was indicative to us as potentially mimicking an organization within Saudi Arabia. Now, we never actually saw that in targeting, but it was for sure of interest to us to note. And we also found another neat egg while conducting keyword searches based off of the domain registration details. So the domain check-updates.com, which we found based on infrastructure overlaps with firewall supports, that domain was registered using the name Sophia Weber. A really short and quick keyword search on that name in the all-knowing Google didn't turn up many options, but it did turn up the domain sakamoto.com. Interesting, right? At least we thought so. We didn't see any activity using that domain, but what was of definite interest to us was this domain was registered not only after the first Sakamoto sample was seen, but also just after we had identified Sakamoto tool testing within VirusTotal. This here is where our 2018 story kind of ended. We put it aside, we shared what we knew with our regional customers, and then moved on. And fast forward to May of 2019, again, the shipping and transportation targeting for Kuwait, we saw beginning around May and June 2019. So when we fast forward to May of 2019, we begin looking into some activities on a customer's infrastructure. First, we notice a unique infrastructure hosting change for the organization's A record. You can see here the change on May 13th, 2019. They were persistent resolution, persistent hosting since January of 2014. And then you can see last seen November 2019, but this one-off that occurred on May 13th, 2019. And as we're attempting to determine whether or not this was legitimate or if something else was going on, out pops Alpharat system again. And we thought, well, that domain looks awfully familiar. What in the world could be going on here? And what you're looking at here on this screen is a hybrid screenshot from autofocus passive DNS and also RiskIQ's passive total. And when we went to view this data in passive total, we could see very clearly the abnormal domain hosting change. At this point in time, again, this was mid-2019, at this point in time, other vendors had already began reporting on DNS hijacking and DNS redirect activity. And so our thoughts immediately went that direction as well. We thought, are we looking at additional redirect activity that hasn't yet been reported, or is this something that is similar and has to do with that? And as we looked further, we identified even more infrastructure, and this time new infrastructure. The first was a domain spoofing Microsoft updates, or Microsoft T as Rob likes to call it. And this Microsoft update domain, this is the domain that led us to our first Hisoka sample. Hisoka, again, is the backdoor malware that was used in the 2019 activity. And this domain was not only used in that DNS redirect activity, but also as command and control. So these were little tidbits that we took note of and interesting, and grabbed that and started pivoting on a little bit more. Hisoka, like Sakamoto, is another anime character. Sakamoto being from Samurai X, and then Hisoka this time being from Hunter x Hunter. And this starts to build up a little bit more excitement for us as analysts. We now have some malware to dig into, which is Rob's area of expertise. But for me as an analyst, I think, okay, well, where's my next stop? And almost instinctively, the all-knowing Google gives us some goodies.
Yeah. So just taking that MicrosoftEupdate.com domain that was the C2 server, that Hisoka sample. The Hisoka we're going to talk about in depth in a little bit, but this showed up on in a Google search for a statistics page, and it was on a Kuwaiti government website. So we started looking into it, because why would that domain be on a government website? Well, so we visited the website in June 2019, and this is what we were presented with. Obviously, I've made it fuzzy, but you can see that I've got an arrow pointing to a space there, and that is an invisible image. And that's where the domain MicrosoftEupdate.com was on the web page. And as you can see here, I've got it underlined. This image is hidden, and it's pointing to microsoftupdate.com/C $, which suggests it's trying to load an image from the C volume on this domain, which seemed a little weird because the C volume wouldn't have any image data on it directly. So we started thinking about what this was, what this was for, and we figured that this is for a credential harvesting campaign. By compromising this website and getting users to carry out a authentication handshake to the domain, and then harvesting those credentials. So how did we confirm this? Well, in our lab, we set up a tool called Responder, which is freely available. You can go get it on GitHub. And what we did was we set this up in our lab on a server. Then we pointed the microsoftupdate.com domain to our server. And then we visited that website. And sure enough, when we visited it, the browser tried to authenticate to the Responder tool. And you can't see here because I've redacted it, but my username and my NTLM password or hash were captured by Responder. And that's what Responder does. It emulates a handshake, so it can get the NTLM hashes from that handshake. And so one of the things that we thought about this, what would they be doing this for? They can do relay attacks with these hashes, but we think they're actually just taking these hashes and trying to either crack them or guess them or whatnot, just based off of what we had seen prior from their techniques, especially in their cheat sheet. So we worked with the government organization, and I should mention that for this to work, Windows networking protocols have to be allowed outbound from your network. So especially the SMB protocol. So that's just something to keep in mind, that it should be blocked at the firewall instead of allowing it to route over the internet. But nonetheless, this was definitely a credential harvesting technique. So we started working with the government organization to get this web server cleaned up. And when I was creating this slide deck back in December of 2019 for another conference, we revisited the website to make sure it was still clean. And at first we were presented with a new look to the website, which suggested that the organization had addressed it. But sure enough, we've got another hidden image at the bottom right here. And this time it's not Microsoft -updates.com as the hidden image. This time it's learn-service.com. Okay, so this is another command and controls domain used by the actors involved with xHunt. And you'll see it's not a Hisoka C2 domain, it's another tools domain, and we're going to talk about those tools in a minute. I am happy to report that right before this webinar, we checked to see if this website has been cleaned, and it is now cleaned for good. So, but it does tell us that the actors still had access to this web server, or the web server was still vulnerable, and they were able to regain access however they did. To update their C2 domain to continue their credential harvesting technique.
Right, and that kind of shows the persistent nature of these type of operators, and the fact that they were alert to it. They were alert. They saw when the organization had tried to correct the issue, and then they went back and added it back in. So these operators are for sure persistent operators. So now we've met Sakamoto, which is the backdoor malware that was used in the 2018 campaign. And we've now briefly met Hisoka, the 2019 backdoor malware. And similar to how we conduct infrastructure pivots, we can do very similar things with tools. And this tools evolution is essentially how we connected the dots between Sakamoto and Hisoka and the other tools or anime characters, as you see on the screen here. And just so everybody else knows, in case you haven't read our blogs or didn't know a lot about this campaign activity, we did not name these tools. In fact, these tools were given, the names were given by whoever it is that developed the set of tools, and we took that, and it was very obvious, and so we just reiterated that instead of thinking of new names for it. We also, again, as Rob mentioned, we don't have enough time in this webcast today to really get into all of these tools in depth. So Rob, as the tool guy, is going to highlight each of these as quickly and efficiently as possible without trying to beat Eminem's rap battle record pace.
Yeah, I'm just going to focus on one or two highlights of each one of these tools, just to kind of, like I said, highlight some of the things that I think are most interesting about them. And we'll start with Hisoka. He's a character in Hunter x Hunter. But this tool is it was the first tool that we came across, and the first version we saw was version 0.8, as the screenshot suggests. Fully functional backdoor. Has two different command and control channels. It can use DNS tunneling, and also a simple HTTP HTTP C2 channel as well. So we had pretty good understanding of Hisoka right after we did the analysis on the first attack. And then later on, we ended up seeing another attack that used an updated version of Hisoka. It was actually version 0.9, unlike what the screenshot shows you. Just like their poor spelling, the xHunt actors are actually really bad at versioning their tools. So they'll have different numbers in different places. So it's really hard to kind of keep track of it. But this is version 0.9. And so as a malware analyst, I wanted to know what was new about version 0.9. Why did they do a minor version to their tool? What did they change? Well, it turns out the version 0.9, the newer version, had 3 different command and control channels. It had DNS tunneling still. They had updated HTTP to use HTTPS. But the third one is the one that is most interesting, and I'm going to talk about that one in detail. It's abbreviated EWS here on the screen, but this is using Exchange Web Services for its command and control channel. And we see email-based command and control channels fairly often, but this one was kind of clever and novel, and we hadn't really seen this technique used before, and that's why I'm going to talk about it in detail. So instead of sending emails to an actor-controlled email account, Hisoka will use the EWS API calls to create a draft of an email, and the actor would log into that same email account and check the drafts folder for communications. So it's almost like a kind of a dead drop command and control channel where there's messages saved to the drafts folder, and then that's how they're passed. They're not sent, they're just saved. So let's take a look at that. What I did was I set up an Exchange server so you can visualize what this command and control channel looks like. So this is the original beacon from Hisoka. It is when it wants to send a beacon to the C2 to tell the C2 server that it's there. It creates this email draft with a subject of present, and the to field has a unique identifier for the system at contoso.com. This just tells the C2 server, hey, I'm here, I'm ready to get a command. And to do so, the C2 server will send a command by creating a draft in the same drafts folder, same inbox. And the subject of this draft will be project. And in the to field, it'll have that same unique identifier. So, the Hisoka tool knows that it was meant for it. And the body of this email will have base64 encoded ciphertext that contains a command. In this case, I made the command C-get, and then this path to test.txt. All that does is tells Hisoka to upload that test.txt file to the C2 server. But by upload, they're going to transfer that file to the C2 by creating another email draft. And this is how it would look. To upload a file to the C2 server or to the actor, it would create a subject called present, just like the beacon. But this time it would attach the test.txt file to the draft, and in the message body, you'll have another encoded and encrypted message that says test.txt attached, love Hisoka. So this is, I've never seen this before. So it was kind of a novel and clever technique to communicate between the payload and the actors in a non-traditional kind of way. A few things that I'd like to admit here. The screenshots here show 3 drafts in the drafts folder. In a real scenario, there wouldn't be any drafts left over because as these emails are processed, they're deleted from the drafts folder. So that goes to show you that it'd be really difficult to detect this because no emails are being sent externally, and the files are deleted after they're processed. So pretty clever. We had to go and create IPS signatures specifically for this because of its novel nature.
Rob, quick question. We had a question about whether Hisoka and the other tools you're talking about, if they're Windows specific or if they're cross-platform.
Very much Windows specific. And I was going to mention this a little later on, but so Sakamoto, Hisoka, Notaro, which I haven't talked about, and Gone are all written in C#, but they're written specifically for Windows. They're not cross-platform.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay, so let's move on to Notaro. Notaro, as the usage here would suggest, is just a version of Hisoka. Why the malware author decided to rename it, we're not sure. But Notaro and Hisoka are very similar. It's just Notaro has most of the functionality of Hisoka broken up into executables that are embedded within it. And when they want to execute the functionality, they would drop those executables to the system, then run them. So they're not embedded within the main payload. So it's more of a modular, more modular in nature. And we think they were using that for bypassing security controls and detection. And you'll see that in a second. Few things about this usage that I want to point out specifically. Here you can see another kind of connection with Sakamoto because the usage instructions flat out say that it's compatible with Sakamoto version 3.4. Now we don't know exactly what that means. Are they referring to the C2 server as Sakamoto 3.4, or is it the project name? We're not entirely sure, but this is a pretty good indication that they're related in some form. And the other part of this I'm gonna point out is the first line there, bypassing Palo Alto trap. Hope so. This, as employees of Palo Alto, was kind of eye-opening. We immediately started looking at this to see if they were able to successfully bypass our endpoint product, which was called traps. They were hopeful that it would, but it turned out they weren't. But this does tell us a lot about the operators themselves. They are aware of the security protections that are in place, specifically the vendors that are installed over at their targets. Gives you a little bit more insight into their understanding of who they're targeting. So they obviously have some sort of reconnaissance built into their operations. So that was interesting. So let's move on to Gone real quick. The Gone tool, Gone is the main character of Hunter x Hunter, and this tool, as you can see here, is a graphical user interface, and it's password protected. And you may recall Sakamoto was password protected. And guess what? It's the same password, that number 92. And we don't know what that number means, if it has some sort of significance, but it shows up in multiple places. You can also see that this screen also has snapping tool as its window name, which was the same as the password window name in Sakamoto. So there's definite connection between these two. And in fact, when you enter the password and you go to the main screen, while it looks different and set up differently, most of the functionality in Gone is obtained directly from the Sakamoto code base. So it's just set up differently. But the one thing I want to call out about Gone, which was interesting, was that it has the ability to scan for and brute force login to systems on the same network. And it includes a password list here. And this is just obviously a subset of the passwords, but there's all sorts of augmentations of ABC123 and password elite speak. But over off to the left, you see that there's also Kuwait 2017, Kuwait 12345, those kind of passwords as well. Which is interesting because Kuwait is the only country that shows up in this entire list. There's no other country listed. So that suggests that this tool is used by this group for targeting Kuwait. At least, I mean, that's what we're speculating. Okay, so let's move on to Kahlua, which is another Hunter x Hunter character. And I'm not going to talk about Kahlua specifically on its functionality. It's very, very, very similar to Hisoka. And the few things I do want to call out is, unlike the other tools that were written in C#, as I mentioned, Kahlua is written in Visual C++. And we don't know the reason for that, whether it's a different malware author altogether, or maybe they just wanted the tool to look visually different to evade signatures or detection. We're not entirely sure, but it is written in a different language. As you can see here on the screen, the Kahlua tool also uses DNS tunneling, but the domain that it tunnels to is learnservice.com. And if you remember from a few slides back, this is that same domain that was on the government website for credential harvesting. So they're reusing their domains within multiple different places in their operation. So here you can see it's running C who am I from as a command. Capital C was the same command identifier as you probably noticed in the email C2 channel that I showed for Hisoka. In fact, if you were to run C-help, it shows a usage that is extremely similar to Hisoka. So this just shows that even though it's written in a different language, it is very, very similar to prior tooling. Okay, so the last tool I'm going to talk about here is this tool called I, which is kind of a deviation from the characters in Hunter x Hunter. But it's a command line tool, and it's got this cool ASCII art that it displays. But this tool is it's pretty much only used to cover their tracks. So because this group uses RDP to use graphical user interfaces and stolen credentials to log into those RDP sessions, this tool is meant to just watch for all the processes that are created while they're logged in via RDP. And if someone else logs into the same system, it will kill all those processes, delete all the files that were created, and log out. And this is just to cover their tracks to kind of remain under the radar, to not obviously expose themselves to the real operator, the real user of that system.
Right, so after doing all of this analysis, looking at all these tools, we're seeing some of these domains pop up in multiple places. We're seeing that in the HTML code injection, and we're also seeing the domains used as command and control in backdoor malware. But we're still left wondering exactly who the heck was doing this. We had hunches based off of the targeting and based off of the overall domain naming patterns and the domain registration patterns. And this had very much the feels of standard Iranian cyber activities, which friends in the community helped us to validate, but infrastructure early on was always a bit opaque. If we went wide with a /24 infrastructure analysis, which is a really wide net, you get a lot of results, and they're not necessarily results that we would consider high fidelity connection. And that's just an analytical preference of our own. But even when we took that net, even when we went a little smaller, there were still overlaps that had us questioning what we were looking at. Yes, of course, we saw infrastructure overlaps with oil rig, but we also saw a sprinkle of muddy water and a handful of others. And these buckets weren't sitting on the same seesaw together either. We saw overlaps with the DNS hijacking activities reported by both FireEye and CrowdStrike at least, and in addition to our own DNS redirect activities. And we also saw overlaps with DNS espionage, And these are all close encounters, but none of them were close enough for us to really make a determination, especially knowing that we weren't sure how broad our visibility was. Our visibility with this activity could potentially be too tight, and there could be things that we were missing. We also saw indication of activities that, as Rob mentioned, that appeared to allow the capability to track people, which is, to most in the community, probably feels a little like something else. Schaefer might be one of them. And this is why we decided to refer to this activity as a campaign instead of a group. We called it the xHunt campaign instead of rolling it up into something else. We figured that we can fill in that gap once we know more. So we took what we knew and we visualized it within our playbook viewer. We separated the campaigns, which you can see kind of in the middle, right under playbook viewer. We separated those campaigns to show how we saw the techniques used within each of those activities. These playbooks are modeled after MITRE's attack framework, so you're able to really depict a detailed threat overview based on your own visibility. You can export this into sticks format, or you can go grab your own viewer from GitHub. It's all open source to GitHub, and continue on and kind of create a visual for your analysis. Some other takeaways were trying to figure out exactly how broad this campaign activity was. We saw Kuwaiti government targeted in 2018. We saw the Kuwaiti shipping and transportation industry targeted in 2019. But was there more? We know that at least one domain, the alpharetsystem.com domain, we know that at least one domain was potentially indicative of Saudi Arabia targeting. And we knew based on their cheat sheet that there were potentially other countries of interest. But what we didn't know was that code copied from some other tool, or do they also have an interest in targeting those other countries? And as Rob also mentioned early on, it appears as though they configure their tools to be pretty specific to who or what it is they are targeting. We also saw lots of malware used. Sakamoto in 2018 and Hisoka and the rest of the gang in 2019. But it still left us wondering why anime? I guess not everything has to have a reason. It could have been just for fun. The tool developer could have chose this because they like it, or does it mean something else? We aren't sure of that. We also observed some novel or semi-novel, depending on how you look at it, techniques as well. Specifically here, email command and control. While the concept of email command and control is not new, the method of using Exchange Web Services to create those email drafts for communication, we sure hadn't seen it done that way before. And so what we had to do was sit back and work to create some new detection signatures because of that. And then this technique here, which by definition can be considered a watering hole of sorts, or at a high level just referred to as a strategic web compromise. It is referred to in the attack framework as drive-by compromise, assuming that I did it right. But this shows the HTML code injection on the Kuwaiti website. These operators are essentially, they're finding these alternative techniques to traditional spear phishing. They're finding ways to conduct man-in-the-middle type of attacks and credential harvesting, ways to get these vital login details, and they're redirecting infrastructure. They're researching organizational security defensive capabilities, specifically at least with Palo Alto networks and what they were researching to target our customers. And this really, again, it shows their patient but persistent mode of operation. These guys and gals, probably, they're smart, and it really does take a community to slow them down.
Awesome.
Yeah. On that, I just want to say thanks to everyone, just for joining us and hearing us speak to this specific threat. I've included a couple URLs here, just for the playbook viewer that's hosted on GitHub, but also our URL to our blog, or the blogs that are tagged with xHunt. So if you want more insight and detail into what happened in these campaigns, you can go check out those blogs. They have a ton of detail in it. And if there are any questions that you don't necessarily want to ask, you can always just reach out to us on Twitter. There's our handles, and we're pretty quick and happy to interact with the community at any time. So thanks again.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Robert. Brittany, we're running up on time. So a couple questions we didn't get a chance to answer, but yeah, hit them both up on Twitter, or you can always email us at the letter Q@sans.org and we can pass along questions, but I'll give a +1. These blogs are awesome on xHunt. There's a lot of detail in there about how the team unfurled this interesting campaign. So we'll start to wrap up with that. So action items for you. Think about how this xHunt campaign applies to your organization. If you're like a Kuwaiti organization, Middle Eastern organization, yeah, pretty clearly they might target you. But if not, think about, well, could they change in the future? Adversaries constantly change. Are there certain, signposts you could look for, or keeping an eye on Unit 42's blog if they see different targeting in the future? And if you feel like xHunt isn't really in your threat model, think about some of the methodology and the techniques you've learned about today, whether it's DNS tunneling, how to pivot with passive DNS, or even one thing I loved was kind of the clustering by campaign rather than group. If you don't know who's behind it, I love the decision to cluster by campaign. So thinking about some of the methodology that Robert and Brittany have walked you through, that's really, really valuable for anyone who's doing this kind of analysis. And lastly, on a human note, please take care of yourselves. Remember that you and the work you're doing are really important right now, but be patient with yourselves, your coworkers. Tough time for everyone, but we really appreciate you joining us today. Making time to learn about xHunt, hearing all the awesome research that Brittany, Robert, and their team have done. So with that, thank you all so much for joining us. Here are some references, a lot of the great research people are sharing on coronavirus-themed threats, a lot of the annual reports. We'll be posting all of these slides at the URL on our final slides, so you can check them out there. We'll also be posting the recording later on today. With that, we'll wrap up. Thank you all so much for joining us. Thanks to Robert and Brittany for presenting, and we hope to see you all in the future. Take care.